A man walks through the streets of Jerusalem while the sky darkens unnaturally. Passers-by run in panic, but he moves forward with determination. In his eyes, a mixture of fear and resolve. He had just made a decision that would risk everything he had built over decades. His wealth, his reputation, his place on Israel's highest council. Everything was about to crumble. Why? Because of a body. The body of a condemned man hanging from a Roman cross. Joseph of Arimathea never imagined his name would echo through the centuries, nor did he imagine that his actions during the most critical 72 hours in human history would transform him from spectator to protagonist. Who was this man who, amid chaos and fear, found courage to step forward when everyone else fled? What led a member of the Jewish elite, a man of status and influence, to risk everything for someone who had just been executed as a common criminal? This man's story reveals a perspective on courage and conviction that few know. A journey that began long before that fateful day and culminated in an act of quiet defiance that would change his life forever. What happened in the 72 hours when Joseph of Arimathea challenged not only the Sanhedrin, but the entire balance of power in Jerusalem? The answer to this question reveals not just a crucial moment in the biblical narrative, but also a profound example of how a single decision can define an eternal legacy. First-century Jerusalem was a city of dramatic contrasts, dominated by the imposing temple, whose white stone walls gleamed in the sun like snow. The city teemed with pilgrims during religious festivals. In the narrow, winding streets, the aroma of spices mingled with the smell of animals and the constant buzz of business negotiations and theological discussions. Imagine Washington, D.C. during a presidential inauguration, but without electricity, proper sanitation, and with political tensions ready to explode at any moment. In this setting lived Joseph, a man from Arimathea, a small town northwest of Jerusalem. Unlike most, Joseph belonged to the most privileged class of Jewish society. As a wealthy and respected man, he owned land, had servants, and held an enviable position on the Sanhedrin, the supreme religious and civil council of the Jews. This council, composed of 71 members, functioned as a combination of Supreme Court and Senate, regulating virtually every aspect of Jewish life. Becoming a member of the Sanhedrin was no simple feat. It required years of studying the scriptures, an impeccable reputation, and often powerful family connections. Joseph had achieved this status through decades of dedication to Jewish traditions and laws. To contextualize, it would be like being a Supreme Court justice or a respected senator today, someone whose opinion carried weight and whose position meant access to society's most influential circles. Joseph's life unfolded during a time of profound political turmoil. Judea had been under Roman occupation for decades. The emperor was distant in Rome, but his presence was felt through heavy taxes, troops patrolling Jerusalem's streets, and the supreme authority of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Jews lived in constant tension, balancing between maintaining their religious traditions and not provoking Rome's wrath. The Sanhedrin, to which Joseph belonged, walked a fine line. On one hand, it needed to maintain the appearance of authority before the Jewish people. On the other, it knew its power existed only to the extent that Rome allowed. This reality created deep internal divisions between those who advocated more open collaboration with the Romans and those who quietly resisted. Amid this complex political landscape emerged a Galilean preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. His teachings, miracles, and growing popularity began to trouble both religious and Roman authorities. For many in the Sanhedrin, Jesus represented a threat to the established order and a potential catalyst for more severe Roman intervention. Joseph, however, observed Jesus with different eyes. The Gospels describe him as a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision and action against Jesus. Luke adds that Joseph was waiting for the kingdom of God, suggesting he was part of a group anxiously awaiting the promised Messiah. The internal conflict Joseph faced was immense. As a Sanhedrin member, he was expected to align with his colleagues. As a man who secretly believed in Jesus, he found himself divided between his social position and personal convictions. This is the dilemma many face when their personal beliefs collide with the expectations of their social or professional group. When the Sanhedrin finally decided to arrest and try Jesus, Joseph found himself at the center of this internal conflict. The Gospels suggest he did not support the condemnation, but also did not openly oppose it. Like many who fear the social consequences of their convictions, Joseph kept his faith secret for fear of the Jewish leaders, as John reports. This was the man who, within hours, would be confronted with the most important decision of his life. a choice that would force him out of the shadows and take a stand that could not be ignored by either the Sanhedrin or Roman authorities. The day began like any other in Jerusalem during Passover. Crowded marketplaces, pilgrims seeking lodging, the temple bustling with activity. For Joseph of Arimathea, however, the morning brought disturbing news. Jesus of Nazareth had been arrested during the night and would be brought to trial before Caiaphas, the high priest. Joseph received the call for the Sanhedrin's extraordinary session with apprehension. Normal procedures required capital trials to occur during daylight and never during religious festivals. That hasty convocation violated traditions respected for centuries. Something was wrong. Upon entering the meeting chamber, Joseph felt the charged atmosphere. The normally serene faces of the elders now displayed grim determination. The circular room, with its seats arranged in a semicircle, seemed more like an Inquisition tribunal than the council of wise men it was supposed to be. Joseph took his place in silence. Jesus was brought in, still bearing marks from the night's interrogation. Joseph watched as inconsistent witnesses presented accusations. Normal procedure required coherent testimonies. This was not a trial but a formality to legitimize a decision already made. When Caiaphas finally asked Jesus directly if he was the Messiah, the Son of God, the answer sealed his fate. "I am," Jesus said, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." For many on the council, this was blasphemy enough. The moment for voting arrived. One by one, the Sanhedrin members declared Jesus guilty. When Joseph's turn came, he faced his first moment of truth. The Gospels don't record his vote, but mention he had not consented to their decision and action. Perhaps he abstained. Perhaps he voted against but was ignored by the majority. Either way, his silent opposition wasn't enough to change the outcome. Jesus was sent to Pilate, the Roman governor. Joseph followed at a distance, watching as the crowd that days before had acclaimed Jesus with palm branches now shouted for his crucifixion. The contrast couldn't have been more shocking. The morning sun moved across the sky as Roman soldiers led Jesus and two other condemned men outside the city. The place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, was a rocky elevation next to a busy road. The Romans deliberately chose such locations. Crucifixion wasn't just punishment, but a public warning. Joseph watched from afar, his heart heavy. The next 3 hours brought darkness over the land in broad daylight, a phenomenon that left everyone astonished. From a distance he heard Jesus' final cry before his death. At that moment, something extraordinary happened in Jerusalem. The thick temple veil, separating the most holy place from the rest of the sanctuary, tore from top to bottom. For a devout Jew like Joseph, the symbolism was undeniable. The barrier between God and man had been removed. With the sun beginning to descend on the horizon, Joseph faced a crisis. The Sabbath would begin at sunset. According to Jewish law, bodies could not remain exposed during the Sabbath, especially that week, when the Sabbath coincided with Passover. On the other hand, the Romans frequently left the crucified exposed for days as a warning. It was then that Joseph made his boldest decision. The Gospels report Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, summoning courage, went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Understanding the magnitude of this gesture requires comprehending the risk involved. By requesting Jesus' body, Joseph was publicly identifying himself as a sympathizer of a man the Sanhedrin had just condemned for blasphemy. He was challenging not only his council colleagues, but also risking his reputation with Roman authorities. In modern times, it would be like a Supreme Court justice openly defending someone their colleagues had just condemned as a traitor. The professional and personal risk was immense. Mark records that Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixions normally lasted days. Before releasing the body, Pilate summoned the responsible centurion to confirm the death. Only then did he grant Joseph's request. With permission obtained, Joseph acted quickly. He bought a fine linen cloth, a detail highlighting his wealth, as such fabric was extremely expensive. He headed to Golgotha, where Roman soldiers were probably still guarding the crucified. What followed must have been an extraordinary scene. A richly dressed man, clearly a member of the Jewish elite, approaching a Roman cross with authorization to remove a body. The soldiers, accustomed to seeing poor relatives begging for the remains of their loved ones, must have been perplexed by Joseph's presence. Removing a body from the cross was no simple task. The nails piercing wrists and feet needed to be extracted. The body, stiff from death, needed to be lowered carefully. Joseph probably received help from servants, though the Gospels mention only Nicodemus, another secret Sanhedrin member who brought about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes for the burial. The amount of spices brought by Nicodemus was extraordinary, enough for a royal funeral. This detail suggests that, even in death, these men were treating Jesus with exceptional honor. They were declaring, through their actions, that the man condemned as a criminal deserved the respect reserved for the great. With the body removed, washed, and wrapped in linen with spices according to Jewish custom, Joseph faced another problem: where to bury it. Executed criminals normally didn't receive honorable burials. Their families often had to bury them in common graves, designated for such cases. It was then that Joseph made another surprising decision. Near Golgotha, he owned a garden with a new tomb, freshly cut into the rock. This tomb had probably been prepared for himself or his family, a luxury few could afford. Offering this tomb for Jesus was no trivial gesture. It was equivalent to giving up a high-value family mausoleum for someone publicly dishonored. The Gospels describe the tomb as new, where no one had yet been laid. This detail is significant in the narrative, as it eliminates any possibility of confusion about who would be in the tomb later. The evangelist John adds another crucial detail. The tomb was in a garden near the crucifixion site. The proximity explains why it was chosen. Time was running out with the approach of the Sabbath. Joseph and Nicodemus worked against the clock. The body was placed in the tomb, and a large stone was rolled to close the entrance. Luke records that the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee observed everything from a distance, carefully noting where the body had been placed. They would return as soon as the Sabbath ended, bringing their own ointments and spices. With the burial completed, and the sun setting on the horizon, Joseph returned to Jerusalem. The Sabbath had begun, a Sabbath like no other in Israel's history. While others prepared for Passover celebrations, Joseph must have withdrawn in reflection. His actions that day had crossed a line from which there was no return. To understand the depth of what Joseph had done, it's important to note that contact with a corpse made him ceremonially unclean for Passover celebrations. In other words, by caring for Jesus' body, he deliberately excluded himself from the most important festivities in the Jewish calendar. The man who had probably spent his entire life meticulously observing the law now placed compassion and devotion above ritual. During that Sabbath, while Jesus' body lay in Joseph's tomb, Jerusalem continued in turmoil. Matthew reports that the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate, concerned about the possibility that Jesus' disciples might steal the body and claim resurrection. They obtained authorization to seal the tomb and post guards. Joseph likely heard about these measures. Perhaps he was directly confronted by his Sanhedrin colleagues. "Why did you give your own tomb to this blasphemer?" they might have asked. The scriptures don't record such confrontations, but it's hard to imagine his actions passed without repercussions. The tomb where Joseph placed Jesus' body remained sealed and guarded throughout the Sabbath and the following night. The critical 72 hours that began with Jesus' arrest were coming to an end, and then in the early hours of the first day of the week, something happened that would change not only Joseph's life but the course of human history. What the Gospels don't explicitly tell us, but what we can deduce from subsequent events, is what happened to Joseph after that historic Sunday. The early morning hours brought news that must have been simultaneously shocking and validating for him. The tomb was empty. The body he had placed there with such care and risk was no longer there. As news spread, different explanations emerged. The guards claimed they had fallen asleep and that the disciples had stolen the body. Others said the women simply went to the wrong tomb. But soon reports of encounters with the resurrected Jesus began circulating throughout Jerusalem. For Joseph, these reports must have provoked deep reflection. If true, they confirmed his intuition about Jesus had been correct from the beginning. If false, he had risked everything for a mistake. What we know is that Joseph never publicly contested the resurrection reports, a significant silence for a man in his position. What few realize is that Joseph's tomb involuntarily became Christianity's first holy place. The location where Jesus' body was placed and from which he rose became the focal point of the nascent faith. And this place belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. His name would forever be linked not just to the burial but to the site of the resurrection. The period that followed brought consequences that the biblical Gospels focused primarily on Jesus don't fully detail. But ancient traditions and historical references give us clues about what might have happened to Joseph. The most immediate and likely consequence was his expulsion from the Sanhedrin. By publicly identifying himself as a Jesus follower, Joseph probably lost his seat on the council. John 9:22 mentions that the Jewish leaders had already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. This excommunication, called herem in Hebrew, meant complete social isolation. For a man of Joseph's position, such exclusion represented more than losing a position. It meant the rupture of business relationships, family connections, and social status. Longtime friends probably distanced themselves. Business partners may have terminated contracts. His life, built over decades, crumbled in days. What few know is that ancient traditions, preserved mainly in Eastern and British churches, suggest Joseph had a remarkable life after these events. While canonical scriptures remain silent about his fate, persistent traditions indicate he may have traveled to distant regions, possibly even to the British Isles.
A particularly intriguing tradition, preserved at Glastonbury Abbey in England, suggests Joseph traveled as a merchant to Roman Britain and brought Christianity to that region. Although modern historians question these narratives, they demonstrate the lasting impact Joseph's actions had on early Christian imagination. What we can state with more certainty is that Joseph probably joined the emerging Christian community in Jerusalem. Acts 1:13-14 mentions that after Jesus' ascension, the apostles all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. It's reasonable to assume that Joseph, having demonstrated such dedication during the burial, was among the first converts. A surprising revelation about Joseph emerges when we consider his role in the context of the church's early days. He represents a rare type of follower, someone from the upper classes, who embraced a faith that initially attracted mainly the poor and marginalized. Paul would write years later, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. Joseph was the exception. A wealthy, powerful and respected man who risked everything for his faith. In many ways, he embodied before it was even articulated the principle Jesus had taught. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" Mark 8:36. Another fascinating revelation about Joseph comes from considering his tomb. The Gospels emphasize it was new and cut into rock. Archaeologists confirm such tombs were extremely expensive in 1st century Jerusalem, costing the equivalent of years of wages for an ordinary worker. What Joseph offered wasn't just a convenient place for a hasty burial, it was a gift of extraordinary value. This tomb was located in a garden. John is the only evangelist who mentions this detail, but it is deeply significant. Private gardens were rare and valuable in arid Jerusalem. They represented wealth and status. The fact that Joseph owned not just a family tomb but a garden surrounding it reinforces his high economic status. There's another often overlooked layer of meaning, the theological symbolism of the garden. The biblical narrative begins in a garden, Eden, where death entered the world, and ends with Jesus being buried and rising in another garden, a new beginning for humanity. Joseph, without realizing it, provided the stage for this powerful parallel. Few also noticed that the linen cloth purchased by Joseph would become one of the first Christian relics, known variously as the Holy Shroud or Sindone. Fabrics that supposedly wrapped Jesus' body became objects of veneration in later centuries. Although the authenticity of these relics is the subject of intense scientific and theological debate, they demonstrate how even the smallest details of Joseph's actions acquired lasting significance. One of the most intriguing revelations is Joseph's personal transformation. He went from being a secret disciple, fearful of social consequences, to someone who acted boldly at the crucial moment. John 19:38 describes this change in a subtle but powerful way. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. The contrast between his previous secrecy and subsequent public action reveals a profound transformation. This transition from private faith to public witness echoes the journey of many believers through the centuries. Joseph's story resonated strongly with early Christian communities facing persecution. Eusebius, a 4th century historian, mentions that during Roman persecutions, wealthy Christians frequently interceded for the bodies of executed martyrs, consciously imitating Joseph's actions. Another surprising revelation comes from considering Nicodemus's role alongside Joseph. John's Gospel is the only one that mentions Nicodemus helping with the burial. Both Joseph and Nicodemus were Sanhedrin members who initially approached Jesus secretly. Both represented the educated and privileged class. Their partnership in the burial suggests there was a minority faction within the Sanhedrin itself that sympathized with Jesus, a detail that complicates the simplistic narrative of unanimous opposition from Jewish authorities. It's also fascinating to consider the interactions between Joseph and the women who followed Jesus. Luke 23:55 mentions that the women saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. This suggests Joseph didn't act in isolation, but in coordination with other followers. In a society where men and women generally operated in separate spheres, this collaboration around Jesus' burial is remarkable. In our modern world, Joseph's story offers a valuable perspective on the cost of authentic discipleship. He faces the same question many face today: when my personal convictions conflict with my social, professional, or political group, which will prevail? To discover more fascinating stories like this, simply subscribe to the channel. Stories of biblical characters who faced profound moral dilemmas and made courageous choices that echo through the centuries to our day. Joseph of Arimathea's story continues to resonate through the centuries because, at its core, it's a story about finding courage when it's most difficult. At a moment when all of Jesus' declared followers had fled, when even Peter had denied him 3 times, this wealthy and respected man stepped forward. Without grand proclamations or theatrical gestures, just a decisive and courageous action when it mattered most, Joseph's journey makes us question, when critical moments arrive in our lives, do we act according to our convenience or our conscience? Do we remain silent when we should speak, or do we find the courage to stand for what we believe is right, even when it comes at a cost? In our contemporary world, we face similar dilemmas: social pressures to conform, fear of professional rejection, concern about our reputation and position. Joseph experienced all of this intensely during those critical 72 hours. His example reminds us that sometimes a single act of courage can define a legacy. Joseph's story also illuminates the power of acting behind the scenes. While Jesus' closest disciples received more attention in the Gospels, it was this discreet follower who provided the location for the most transformative event in the Christian narrative. Not everyone is called to stages and pulpits. Some, like Joseph, make crucial contributions away from the spotlight. The transformation of Joseph's tomb was particularly powerful as a metaphor. The place he prepared for death and finality became the setting for a new beginning. The tomb that should have contained ending and decay became the source of a new narrative. How many times in our own lives do the places of our greatest losses unexpectedly become the cradles of new beginnings? Joseph teaches us that moments of crisis reveal our true character. Through years on the Sanhedrin, he had cultivated a reputation for prudence and conformity. But when the critical moment arrived, it revealed a courage he perhaps didn't even know he possessed. We are defined not by the titles we carry or positions we occupy, but by the choices we make when confronted with the conflict between safety and conscience. The empty tomb that Joseph offered continues to be a powerful symbol. It began as a gesture of respect to a deceased teacher. It transformed into the setting for renewed hope. And through the centuries, it has inspired countless others to make their own sacrificial offerings, large and small, visible and invisible. Joseph of Arimathea never spoke a word in the Gospels. We have no records of his sermons or teachings. What we have is the record of an action, a moment of moral courage when it mattered most. And perhaps that's the point. In the end, we won't be remembered so much for what we said, but for what we did in the critical moments of our lives. In a world that often encourages us to calculate costs and benefits, to ponder personal consequences before acting, Joseph reminds us that some actions transcend such calculations. Some choices are made not because they're advantageous, but because they're right. Not because they're safe, but because they're necessary. At the end of those 72 hours, Joseph of Arimathea was a transformed man. He had crossed the chasm between private belief and public witness. He had risked his position, reputation, and security for something greater than himself. And in this act, he became more than a wealthy Sanhedrin member. He became part of a story that continues to inspire moral courage to this day. The borrowed tomb remains empty, and in this emptiness, we find a powerful reminder. Sometimes, what we offer with great sacrifice returns to us as an even greater blessing.